Somewhere in a major international airport right now, there is a corridor that appears on every building schematic, is covered on both ends by fully functioning surveillance equipment, and has no blind spots, according to every technician who has ever reviewed the system. A man walked into that corridor on a Tuesday afternoon, in full view of 200 people, and he has not been seen since. Nobody has ever explained it. Welcome to Midnight Outcry, where we collect the accounts that official reports cannot contain. Tonight, every story takes place inside the transit systems of the world airports, train stations, subway lines, the long, featureless corridors between one place and another. The people speaking to you tonight are former security personnel, frequent travelers, transit workers, and ordinary passengers who experienced something inside these systems that changed the way they think about movement, about surveillance, and about the assumption that the world is fully mapped and fully understood. All names and identifying details have been changed or withheld at the request of the narrators. Some of these individuals still work in aviation or transit security and cannot be identified without professional consequences. Others simply do not want to be found by whatever it is they believe found them first. If any part of what you hear tonight sounds familiar, if you have had an experience in a terminal, a corridor, a platform, or a boarding gate that you have never been able to explain, you are not alone, and we want to hear from you. Subscribe to Midnight Outcry and turn on your notifications so you never miss a new upload. Now let us begin. The last time I reviewed the footage, I counted 47 separate camera angles covering that section of the terminal, and not one of them showed him leaving. That was 11 years ago. I still pull up the archived file sometimes, late at night, and I watch him walk into frame, and I wait for what I know is coming, and every time I feel the same cold drop in my stomach when the timestamp advances, and he simply does not come out the other side. My name is Daniel, and in the autumn of the year, I turned 34. I was the overnight shift supervisor for ground security at a mid-sized international airport in the American Midwest. I had been in that role for 6 years at that point. I knew the camera system the way a musician knows their instrument, every angle, every dead zone, every quirk of the low-light rendering on the older units near the international gates. I was good at my job. I want you to understand that before I tell you anything else, because what I am about to describe is the reason I eventually left that position, and I have spent a decade trying to make sure it does not sound like the story of a man who cracked under pressure or started seeing things after too many overnight shifts. This is what the footage shows. This is what it does not show. And the difference between those two things is the reason I cannot sleep through a full night without waking at 3 in the morning with the specific and sourceless feeling that something is standing just outside my bedroom door. It was a Thursday in late October. The terminal had been quiet all evening. A weather system moving in from the northwest had delayed most of the incoming international flights, which meant the arrivals hall was running at about 30% of its usual volume. I had done 2 full walkthroughs of my sector by 10 o'clock, and everything was exactly as it should be. The corridors smelled the way they always smelled at that hour, that particular combination of industrial floor cleaner and recycled air, and the faint ghost of coffee from the kiosks that had closed 4 hours earlier. The lighting in the main concourse was on its overnight setting, dimmed to about 60%, which gave everything that slightly flattened quality that I always associated with the end of a shift. The monitors on my station were showing clean feeds on all 47 cameras. I remember noticing that the temperature in the building had dropped slightly, because the HVAC system always ran cooler when the passenger count fell below a certain threshold, and I had pulled on my jacket about an hour before all of this started. There was one thing I noticed, and then immediately set aside one of the corridor cameras on the B concourse. Camera B14 had developed a faint horizontal flicker in the upper left quadrant of its frame. It happened about once every 40 seconds and lasted less than a quarter of a second. I logged it for the maintenance team and moved on. I had seen cameras do that before. It meant nothing. The first thing that did not fit happened at 11:17. A man appeared on camera A9, which covered the main entrance to the B concourse corridor, a long straight passage about 60 meters in length that connected the international arrivals processing area to the domestic baggage claim. He was traveling alone, He was carrying a single dark-colored rolling suitcase and wearing a gray coat. He appeared to be somewhere between 50 and 60 years of age. His posture was completely normal. He was not moving quickly, not looking around anxiously, not doing anything that would have triggered any of our behavioral screening protocols. He walked into the B concourse corridor at a steady, unhurried pace. I watched him enter the frame on a 9, and then I switched to B1, which was the camera mounted at the far end of the same corridor, pointing back toward the entrance. He should have appeared on B1 within approximately 30 seconds of leaving a 9. He did not appear. I waited. I switched back to a 9. He was gone from that frame too, already out of its range. I pulled up B2 through B13, all of which covered successive sections of that same corridor. He was not on any of them. I told myself there was a processing lag on the recording system. It happened occasionally when the servers were under load, and I called down to the corridor on the intercom. No answer, which was normal, because there was no staff posted in that corridor at that hour. I sent my junior officer, a 22-year-old named Marcus, to do a physical check. Marcus walked the full length of the B concourse corridor in both directions. He looked into both of the single-stall restrooms adjacent to the corridor. He checked the maintenance access door, which was locked from the inside with a key that had not been signed out that evening. He found nobody. He came back to the security station, and he looked at me and he said, quietly, that the corridor felt cold, colder than the rest of the building. He said it the way you say something when you want it to sound like an observation rather than a feeling. And I understood exactly what he meant, because I had felt that same reluctance to say a plain thing plainly in that building before. I told him it was probably the HVAC running irregularly in that section. He nodded. Neither of us believed it. The second thing happened at 11:44. The man in the grey coat appeared on camera C7, which was located in an entirely different section of the terminal, the domestic departures hall, which was separated from the B concourse corridor by a set of secured doors that required either a boarding pass scan or a staff keycard to open. There was no record of either door being triggered during the period between his disappearance from the corridor and his reappearance on C7. He was still pulling the same dark suitcase. He was still walking at the same steady pace, but something about the way he was moving had changed, and it took me almost a full minute of watching the playback to identify what it was. He was not looking at anything, not at the departure boards, not at the gate signs, not at the floor in front of him. His eyes were fixed at a point somewhere in the middle distance that did not correspond to any object in the terminal. People in airports are always looking at something: their phones, their gate numbers, the faces of people they are meeting. This man was looking at nothing. He was navigating the space with perfect accuracy, walking around pillars, avoiding the cleaning cart parked near gate D4, moving in a straight line toward the far end of the departures hall without appearing to see any of it. He walked to the end of the departures hall and turned left into the connector passage that led to the international pier. I switched cameras to follow him. He appeared on the connector passage camera, walked its full length, and then turned right through the doors into the international pier itself. I was tracking him in real time now, switching feeds ahead of him to keep him in frame. He walked the full length of the international pier, 60 meters, past 14 closed gates. He reached the end of the pier. There was nothing at the end of the pier. No doors, no exit gates, no maintenance access. Just a curved wall of floor-to-ceiling glass looking out onto the dark tarmac. He walked to the glass. He stopped. He put one hand flat against the surface, and then the camera on that end of the pier, one of the older low-light units, produced a single long horizontal flicker, the same flicker I had logged on B14 90 minutes earlier. And when the image resolved, he was gone. I was out of my chair before I had consciously decided to move. I called Marcus on the radio and told him to get to the end of the international pier immediately and not to touch anything. I called the overnight duty manager and told him we had a situation. I pulled every camera feed from the pier and the connector and the departure hall, and I went through them frame by frame for the next 3 hours. He did not leave. He did not go back the way he came. He did not open any door, because no door in that section was opened. The glass at the end of the pier showed no breach in the morning inspection. The tarmac camera covering that section of exterior wall showed nothing approaching or departing from that area during the relevant window. When the Aviation Authority investigators reviewed the footage 2 days later, their official determination was that the man had likely exited through a staff access point that was temporarily off the camera grid due to the maintenance flag I had logged on B14. They said it was a system failure, creating a momentary blind spot. They said it was the most probable explanation. I asked them to show me which staff access point. They said the investigation was ongoing. The investigation was closed 14 months later with no further findings. The man was never identified. No missing persons report matching his description was ever connected to the case. I still have the timestamp of that final flicker saved in a file on my laptop. Some nights I open it, and I look at the frame before and the frame after, and I try to find the difference between the two, the exact pixel where a human being stops existing inside a space that had no exit. I have never found it. What I have found, 3 times in the years since, is that same grey coat, not on the same man, on different men in different airports in different countries, worn with the same unhurried posture, the same fixed middle-distance gaze. I have never approached any of them. I do not know what I would say. I do not know what they would answer. I know only that the last time I saw the coat 14 months ago, in a terminal I will not name, on a man I will not describe beyond the coat itself, I turned to the security monitor beside me and checked the camera covering the corridor he had just entered, and the camera was producing, in its upper left quadrant, a faint horizontal flicker that appeared once every 40 seconds and lasted less than a quarter of a second. I logged it, and I walked away, and I have not been back to that terminal since. What Daniel described happened inside the cold geometry of a building designed to move human beings from one place to another with perfect accountability. But the accounts that reach us most often are not from the terminals themselves. They come from the people whose job it is to work beneath them. The next person who spoke to us had spent 14 years maintaining the infrastructure that passengers never see, and she found something in it that the infrastructure was never designed to contain. I still hear it sometimes when the ventilation kicks on in a quiet room. That specific rhythm. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats. I heard it for the first time 6 stories underground, and the reason I am still alive to talk about it is that I ran before I turned around to see what was making it. My name is Yolanda. I am 41 years old, and for 14 years, I worked as a systems maintenance technician for one of the largest subway networks in North America. The city I worked in I will not name, not because the transit authority asked me not to, they did, but that is not the reason, but because I have no desire to direct curious people toward the section of tunnel where this happened. What is down there does not need to be found, and if you found it, I do not believe you would be able to report back. The tunnel network beneath a major city is not one thing. It is dozens of things layered on top of each other, across more than a century of construction, each layer built by different engineers using different standards and different materials, many of them never fully integrating with the layers above or below. There are sections of tunnel that were sealed during infrastructure updates in the 1960s that have never been reopened. There are maintenance shafts that appear on the original construction drawings, but cannot be located physically, because the walls they were built into were encased in concrete during later expansion work. There are utility corridors that are mapped in one agency's documentation and absent from another's, because the transit authority, the water department, the telecommunications infrastructure, and the city's emergency services network all maintain separate maps that have never been fully reconciled. I knew all of this. It was part of my job to know it. I had worked in that environment long enough that its strangeness was familiar, the way the strangeness of any workplace becomes familiar over years. The smell of electrical discharge and old concrete, and the particular mineral dampness of deep stone. The way sound behaved differently at different depths, absorbing in some tunnels and reflecting in others with a sharpness that could make a dropped wrench sound like a gunshot 200 meters away. The rats, which were always there, and which you stopped noticing after the first year. I had been in those tunnels more times than I could count, and I had never once felt afraid of them in the way that a civilian might be afraid. I want to be precise about this, because what I felt that night was not the normal mild unease of working alone underground. It was specific, it was directed, and it began before I saw or heard anything that justified it. I was on a routine inspection of a ventilation maintenance corridor on the 6th level, which was the deepest operational level of the network, about 40 meters below street level. The work order was for a visual check of the secondary ventilation duct housings following a sensor anomaly that had flagged during the previous shift. The corridor was approximately 3 meters wide and maybe 100 meters long, running parallel to an out-of-service express tunnel that had been decommissioned in the late 90s. The lighting in maintenance corridors at that depth ran on a motion sensor circuit panels illuminating about 15 meters ahead of you as you walked, the ones behind you going dark again after 90 seconds to conserve power. After a few years, you stop noticing it. You are always moving in a moving circle of light, and the darkness behind you just means the corridor you have already checked. That night, the lighting was behaving normally. The temperature was what I expected, around 12 degrees Celsius, which was standard for that depth. I had been in the corridor for about 20 minutes and had checked the first 6 duct housings without finding anything that explained the sensor flag. The 7th housing was at the far end of the corridor, near the sealed access door that connected this maintenance passage to the decommissioned express tunnel. I had been near that door many times. It was welded shut. It had been welded shut since before I started with the transit authority. I had never had any reason to think of it as anything other than infrastructure. I was about 10 meters from the 7th duct housing when I noticed the smell. It was not a smell that belonged in that corridor. Maintenance tunnels at that depth have a consistent olfactory environment: concrete, electrical insulation, the faint biological note of the ventilation system pulling air from surface level. What I smelled was organic in a way that those tunnels were not, something between standing water and something else I could not identify and still cannot name with precision. It was faint enough that I could have dismissed it as a variation in the ventilation airflow, and I almost did. I kept walking. I reached the 7th housing, opened the inspection panel, ran my light across the interior. Everything looked normal. I was about to close the panel when the smell intensified, sharply and suddenly, the way a smell does when its source moves closer to you. I did not move. I stood with my hand on the inspection panel, and I waited. 3 beats, a pause, 3 beats. It was coming from the other side of the sealed door. I have worked around heavy infrastructure my entire adult life. I know the sounds that metal makes when it expands and contracts with temperature changes. I know the sounds that old tunnel walls make when the ground above shifts. I know the sound profile of the ventilation system at every level of that network. What I was hearing was not any of those things. It had a regularity that mechanical sounds do not have. It had a weight to it, a physical pressure in the low frequencies that I felt in my sternum before I heard it with my ears. And it was getting louder, which meant whatever was producing it was approaching the sealed door from the other side. The sealed door moved, not much, not enough to open. The weld held, but the door flexed inward toward me, visibly, a full centimeter of movement along its center seam, and I heard the groan of metal taking stress, and I turned, and I ran. I did not decide to run. My body made that decision without consulting me, and I am grateful for it every day. I ran the full length of the corridor without looking back, hitting the motion sensors as I went, the lights chasing me in the wrong direction now. The darkness behind me lit, and then dark and then lit again as I moved. I hit the corridor exit door, got my keycard out somehow, got through it, and kept running until I was in the main maintenance hub with other people around me, and the door behind me closed, and the sound of the ventilation system, loud enough to cover everything else. I filed an incident report. I described the smell, the sound, the movement of the door. My supervisor reviewed it with me the next morning, and his position was that the sensor anomaly from the previous shift had likely been a pressure differential caused by unusual activity in the decommissioned tunnel settling, he said, or debris movement, and that the door flexion I had observed was consistent with pressure changes in sealed passageways. He was not dismissive in a hostile way. He genuinely believed his explanation. I looked at him sitting across that desk, and I thought about the regularity of those 3 beats, the way they had that biological patience to them, the way the smell had moved with purpose, and I did not say any of that out loud. I signed the report. I requested a reassignment to surface-level maintenance work. I got it 3 months later, and I never went below the 3 level again. I left the Transit Authority 2 years after that night. I work in HVAC systems maintenance now, all surface level, all in buildings where I can see the sky through a window from wherever I am standing. 3 months after I filed my incident report, a survey team was sent into the decommissioned Express Tunnel to assess it for a potential infrastructure project. They spent 2 days mapping the section closest to where I had been working. The project assessment report noted that the survey team had been unable to complete the full mapping of the tunnel due to equipment malfunctions, and that a secondary survey would be scheduled. The secondary survey was never scheduled. As far as I have been able to determine, the infrastructure project was quietly redirected to a different section of the network entirely. Nobody I have spoken to from the Transit Authority has been able to give me a clear explanation of why. The sealed door I was standing in front of that night is still down there. I have to believe it is still holding. Some nights I am not sure enough of that to sleep without the light on, and on those nights I lie in the dark and I listen to the ventilation of my own apartment cycling on, and I count the seconds between sounds, waiting, without meaning to wait, for 3 beats, and a pause, and 3 beats again. The infrastructure beneath a city and the infrastructure above it share one quality that transit workers learn to carry with them: the knowledge that something can be fully mapped and still be completely unknown. The next account came from a man who thought he understood airports the way Yolanda understood tunnels, not as a traveler, but as someone who lived inside the system professionally. What he found was that the system had a part of itself it had never shown anyone. 3 years ago, I started keeping a log of every time I heard the boarding announcement, not because I expected to fly somewhere, because the voice in the announcement is mine, and I have not recorded anything for that airport in over 2 years, and the gate it announces does not exist. That was the beginning of it, or rather, that is when I knew something was wrong, but the thing itself started much earlier. My name is Kieran, and I am 38 years old, and I spent 9 years as an audio production contractor for a large regional airport in the United Kingdom. My job was to produce and maintain the public address system content, the boarding announcements, the security warnings, the ambient messaging, all of it. I recorded the voices, mixed the audio, managed the system libraries. I knew every announcement in that system, the way a composer knows every instrument in their score. I was not a pilot. I was not a security officer. But in terms of understanding the acoustic architecture of that airport, I was probably the most knowledgeable person who worked there, and I say that without any particular pride, only to establish why the thing I experienced was not something I could rationalize past a certain point. The airport had recently undergone a significant expansion. A new international pier had been added, with 8 new gates numbered in a sequence that extended the existing system. I had produced all of the new announcement content for those gates over the preceding 6 months: gate designations, boarding sequences, updated security messaging, standard work. I knew every gate number in that new sequence because I had recorded each one individually and mixed it into the relevant announcement tracks. There was no gate numbered in the way that the announcement I heard used. That number did not exist in the new sequence or the old one. I heard the announcement clearly on a Tuesday morning while I was doing a routine system audit in the main terminal. It played once, through the overhead PA, at normal volume and at normal announcement timing. It used my voice, my contracted recording voice, the one I used for all of the airport's passenger-facing audio. It announced the boarding of a flight with no airline code I recognized, to a destination I will not name here, from a gate number that was not on any map of that airport I had ever seen. Then it did not play again. The terminal continued its ordinary noise. Passengers moved. Nobody around me looked up. I went directly to the PA control room. I pulled the system log for the previous 15 minutes. The log showed no automated announcement during that window. I checked the manual queue. Nothing had been manually triggered. I asked the 2 staff members in the control room if they had heard anything unusual. One said she thought she had heard something, but had assumed it was a test broadcast. The other had not noticed it. I did not tell them what the announcement had said. I went back to my office, and I pulled up the master audio library, and I searched for the gate number I had heard. It was not in the library. The track did not exist. The announcement I had heard, in my own recorded voice, announcing a boarding from a gate that did not exist, was not in the system that produced it. I spent the next 3 weeks trying to find a technical explanation. Corrupted file playing from a legacy backup, crossed signal from a neighboring building's PA system, unauthorized access to the broadcast equipment. None of these explanations held up under examination. The system logs were clean. The neighboring building used a completely different audio format that was incompatible with the terminal's PA architecture. The broadcast equipment showed no signs of unauthorized access. I filed a technical anomaly report with the airport's facilities management team. They investigated and concluded that the most likely explanation was a one-time software glitch causing a corrupted file to broadcast. They recommended a system integrity check, which was performed, and which found nothing anomalous. Case closed. But I had heard the announcement. I had heard my own voice, at the correct volume, with the correct acoustic properties of the terminal's overhead system, announcing a specific gate and a specific destination. And 6 weeks after that morning, while I was passing through the International Pier during a late shift to check on a newly installed speaker cluster near Gate 7, I noticed something I had walked past many times without registering. At the far end of the pier, past the last numbered gate, there was a door. It was set into the wall at the same spacing and with the same design as every other gate door in that pier. It had a gate designation plate above it. The number on the plate was the number I had heard in the announcement. The door had a standard boarding gate handle. I stood in front of it for a long time. The corridor was empty. The last flight from the pier had departed 40 minutes earlier. I put my hand on the handle. I pressed down. The handle moved. I pushed the door open. Behind it was a jetway. Standard construction, standard angle, standard accordion-style connector. It extended out from the building at the normal boarding angle, but there was no aircraft at the end of it. The jetway extended out into open air, and at its far end, beyond the boarding threshold, there was nothing. Not tarmac, not a parked aircraft, not ground crew equipment. The jetway ended, and beyond it was a darkness that did not match the exterior lighting situation of the rest of the apron. A darkness with a quality Weiss cannot describe as anything other than depth. The kind of darkness that does not come from the absence of light, but from the presence of distance, as if the jetway were opening onto something that extended much further than the exterior of any building should. I stood at the threshold for what felt like a very long time. I was not aware of making any sound. I became aware slowly that the temperature at the end of the jetway was dropping, that a cold was coming from that open end that was not the ambient outdoor cold of an autumn night in England. It was a specific cold, directional, like breath from a very large and very patient thing. And then I heard from somewhere in that darkness an announcement, my voice, calling my name, calling it the way it would sound in the final boarding call, calm, professional, with the particular cadence of a public address system, calling me to board. I stepped back. I gripped the edge of the door frame. I pulled the door shut behind me. I walked to the end of the pier, and I did not run because my legs were not fully under my control, and a managed walk was the best I could achieve. I took the lift to the ground level. I sat in the staff car park in my car for an hour before I was able to drive. I resigned my contract 4 months later, citing another opportunity. I did not tell the facilities manager what I had found at the end of the pier. The gate door was sealed shut with a standard maintenance closure notice the following week. I have no idea whether anyone investigated what was behind it. I have asked carefully, in indirect ways, and received only the kind of non-answer that means the question has been noticed and declined, rather than genuinely not understood. I still produce audio work, corporate training videos and podcast production now, from a home studio, nothing that requires me to enter a large transit facility. The announcement I heard that first morning still comes sometimes, not through speakers, not from outside, from somewhere internal, from that approximate location behind the sternum where sound sometimes registers before the ears do. My own voice. A gate that does not exist. A flight with no record. And in the announcement, always that same, even professional tone I spent 9 years perfecting. Saying words I have never fully allowed myself to hear to the end, because some part of me understands that hearing them completely would mean answering them, and I am not ready to know where that departure leads. The transit environment produces these accounts with a consistency that no other setting matches, and the investigators who have attempted to study the pattern share one conclusion. The moment of transit, the space between departure and arrival, seems to operate under rules that the spaces before and after it do not recognize. The final account tonight comes from a woman who spent 3 decades as an international flight attendant and who, on a night flight over the North Atlantic, encountered something in the cabin of a full commercial aircraft that she has not been able to integrate into her understanding of the world, despite 11 years of trying. The last time I checked on him, he was in seat 31C, asleep, with his blanket pulled up to his chin and his reading light on. When I came back through the cabin 12 minutes later, the blanket was folded on the seat. The reading light was still burning. The seat belt was buckled across nothing. He was gone, and we were at 37,000 feet over the Atlantic Ocean, and there was nowhere for a human being to go. I need you to understand the architecture of what I am telling you before you reach for a comfortable explanation, because I reached for every comfortable explanation myself, and none of them survived contact with the facts. My name is Patricia, and I am 62 years old, and I flew international long-haul routes for 31 years for a major European carrier. I have flown through turbulence severe enough to crack overhead bins. I have managed medical emergencies at altitude. I have handled every category of disruptive passenger the airline industry has a name for. I am not a person who loses composure, and I am not a person who tells stories she cannot support with specifics. What I am about to tell you is specific. It was a winter night flight, westbound transatlantic, scheduled duration 8 hours and 40 minutes. We had boarded a full aircraft, 312 passengers, and a crew of 11. I was senior cabin crew, and my section covered rows 22 through 40 in economy. We had reached cruising altitude, completed the meal service, and the cabin lights had been dimmed for the sleep period. Most passengers in my section were asleep, or at least settled. I had done a full walkthrough at 2 hours and 40 minutes into the flight, which put us somewhere over the middle of the Atlantic. Everything was normal. The aircraft had that particular quiet that long overnight flights settle into, that compressed low roar of engines and recycled air, that becomes almost meditative after enough years in the industry. I went to the rear galley to begin preparing for the second service. The galley had that specific stillness of a professional kitchen between services equipment in its correct positions, lighting on the overhead circuit, the soft, persistent mechanical hum of the aircraft around everything. I had been in that galley for about 8 minutes when my colleague came back to tell me that a passenger in 33A was asking about a connection in New York. I went forward to address it. I was gone from the galley for no more than 4 minutes. When I came back, one of the lavatory doors was standing fully open. The lavatory was empty, light on. That was slightly unusual. Passengers generally close the door on exit, but not remarkable enough to hold my attention. I closed it and continued with the service prep. I noticed the smell in the galley briefly, something like the cold that comes off a refrigerator when it has been open too long. But the galley refrigeration units ran cold at altitude, and I had noticed this before. I set it aside. At 3 hours and 50 minutes, I did my second full section walkthrough. 31C male passenger, I estimated mid-50s, had boarded in London and eaten his meal and declined the second drink service and fallen asleep somewhere over Ireland. He was still in his seat, blanket up, reading light on, the pale blue of it falling across a closed eye. I noted him the way you note any sleeping passenger: registered, normal, move on. I continued to the front of the section and then back. The walkthrough took 11 minutes. At 4 hours and 2 minutes, I came through the same section again, heading rearward. Seat 31C. The reading light was on. The blanket was folded with a neatness that registered as wrong before I could say precisely why. Not pushed aside, not tangled at the seat's foot the way a blanket gets when someone wakes and stands, but folded flat, placed deliberately. The the corners aligned. The seatbelt was buckled across an empty seat. I stood in the aisle and looked at that folded blanket for a long moment without moving. I checked both rear lavatories. Empty, doors properly closed. I checked the forward lavatories. Empty. I walked the full length of the cabin twice, looking at every seat, checking every face in the reduced cabin light. 311 passengers. I counted 3 times. 311. I went to the jump seat at the rear, and I sat down and I thought very carefully about what I was going to do. Then I went to the galley and told my colleague what I had found. She walked the cabin herself. She came back and told me she had counted 311 passengers. We were 4 hours from destination, over the middle of the North Atlantic, in an aircraft with no unscheduled stops, no ground access, no mechanism by which a seated and sleeping passenger could cease to be present in the cabin without passing one of us in an aisle that one of us was covering at all times. We reported it to the flight deck. The captain came back personally, which tells you something about how the flight deck was taking this. He walked the cabin. He confirmed our count. We pulled the passenger manifest. Seat 31C was assigned to a man whose name I will not give here. We had his passport scanned from check-in, his boarding pass record, his meal selection on file. He had boarded. He had eaten. He had been observed by 3 separate crew members during the flight. He was not on the aircraft. The captain returned to the flight deck and radioed ahead. When we landed, the aircraft was met at the gate by airline security and the relevant authorities before passengers were allowed to disembark. The aircraft was searched in its entirety. Seat 31CS overhead bin contained a small carry-on bag with the passenger's name tag still attached. His coat was in the seat pocket, in front of his seat. His blanket was still folded. He was not found on the aircraft, in the aircraft, or anywhere in the airport during the hours following the search. The official investigation determined that the most probable explanation was that the passenger had moved to a different seat during the flight and had disembarked with the general passenger flow before the count discrepancy was fully processed. His luggage remaining on the aircraft was described as unusual, but attributed to the possibility that he had retrieved his personal items prior to landing without crew observation. His carry-on was logged and processed through the airline's lost property system. He never claimed it. No missing persons report matching his identity was filed in connection with the flight or the destination airport in the months following the incident. I know this because I checked, periodically, for the first 3 years, and then I stopped checking because the absence of any record was more disturbing than finding one would have been. There is one additional thing I have not told anyone, in an official capacity. During the walkthrough in which I discovered the empty seat, when I was standing in the aisle at row 31, looking at the folded blanket, I was aware of a smell. The same cold refrigeration smell I had noticed in the galley 2 hours earlier. It was strongest directly at that seat. It was not the smell of the seat itself, or the blanket or the cabin air, which has a distinctive recycled metallic quality that I know from 30 years of breathing it. It was the cold space smell, the open refrigerator smell, and it was strongest at precisely the location where a person had been and was no longer. It faded within about 90 seconds. By the time my colleague walked the cabin, it was gone entirely. I did not include it in my statement. I knew how it would land. I still know. But I am including it here because I have come to believe that the smell is important, that it marks something about the way these disappearances happen, that it is a physical trace of whatever process unmakes a person's presence in a space, and if anyone listening to this has encountered that smell in a transit environment, in an airport corridor, or a maintenance tunnel, or an aircraft cabin, or a train car, I want you to know what it preceded the last time I smelled it, and to make whatever choices that knowledge allows you to make. I retired from flying 5 years after that night. I am asked sometimes if I still travel, and the answer is yes, but I do not sleep on aircraft anymore. I spend the full flight watching the cabin. I watch the faces, and I watch the seats, and I watch the aisles, and when the lights are dimmed, I watch the shape of the darkness between the rows. I have never seen anything again that I could not account for, but I know what I counted. I know what was in that seat at 3 hours and 50 minutes, and I know what was not in it at 4 hours and 2 minutes, and the 12 minutes between those 2 times is a space I have been living inside for 11 years now, turning it over, looking for the seam where the ordinary explanation fits. I have not found it. What I have found instead is a very specific kind of attentiveness that I cannot turn off, an awareness of the people around me in transit spaces, an ongoing inventory of who is present and where, that runs beneath everything else I do and do not stop. Every boarding gate, every corridor, every long overnight cabin going dark above the ocean. I count, I keep counting, and I do not know whether I am waiting to find the number right or waiting for the moment when it comes up wrong again, and I have to decide, finally, whether the thing I have been counting is the same kind of thing that was in seat 31C, or whether it is simply human and present and accounted for in the way that I used to believe all of us were. These accounts were shared with Midnight Outcry in confidence and have been presented here with the identities of all narrators protected. The experiences described remain officially unresolved. No authority has offered an explanation that accounts for the full weight of the evidence. No missing person connected to these accounts has ever been found. If you have encountered something in a terminal, a tunnel, a corridor, or a cabin that you have never been able to explain, if you have stood in a transit space and felt the temperature drop and smelled something cold and sourceless and heard a sound you could not locate, we want to hear from you. The links to reach us are in the description below. Subscribe to Midnight Outcry and turn on your notifications. We will be back. We are always back. The accounts keep coming, and the corridors between departures and arrivals are longer than any map has ever shown.